7 years. 7 long, quiet years I lived as a ghost inside my own marriage. To the rest of the world, Allison Sterling was a generational prodigy. At 32, she was the youngest full professor of clinical oncology in the nation, the heiress to the Sterling Medical Group, and a beacon of brilliance revered across global academia. And I was Theodore Blake, the extraordinarily lucky, thoroughly unremarkable husband who had somehow landed a goddess. A housebound appendage. A man whose greatest daily accomplishment, in the eyes of her inner circle, was making sure her coffee was brewed at exactly 65 degrees Celsius when she returned from the laboratory. They believed I had climbed a ladder far beyond my station to touch her hem. They whispered it at galas, dropped sly remarks during dinner parties, and exchanged pitiful glances whenever I served wine to her distinguished colleagues. Over time, even Allison began to believe the myth. She wore my devotion not as a partnership, but as a minor, conveniently quiet domestic amenity. What none of them knew, what Allison herself had never bothered to discover, was that the ground she walked on was built entirely by my hands. 7 years ago, I walked away from the throne of the Blake Consortium, a multi-hundred-billion-dollar global private equity empire that quietly owned controlling shares in 30% of the world's biotechnology giants. I stripped off the tailored suits, abandoned the boardrooms of Zurich and London, and placed my vast industrial leverage into dormancy. I did it all for her, because I loved her with a desperate, singular devotion, and because she once told me, with tears in her eyes on a cold bench outside her university, that her dream was to heal the world without being crushed by the corporate machines. So, I became her invisible shield. When her initial clinical trial was about to be canceled due to a sudden $8 million funding deficit, it wasn't a miracle grant from the state that saved her. It was a discretionary transfer from an offshore entity I controlled. When her state-of-the-art spectrograph broke down and the lead time for a replacement was 18 months, I quietly bought out the Swiss manufacturer overnight and had a unit delivered to her lab within 48 hours under the guise of an equipment lottery. When her father's medical enterprise hit a liquidity crisis that threatened to bankrupt her family, I restructured their sovereign debt through shadow intermediaries, absorbing their liabilities while letting her father take the victory lap. I pushed her toward the stars, content to remain the darkness that made her shine. Until tonight, the living room of our suburban estate was wrapped in absolute silence. The 85-inch television screen flickered with vivid, high-definition broadcast lights. The lower banner read in bold, golden text, "The Nolan Breakthrough Award in Medicine, live from Geneva." The Nolan Award, the single highest pinnacle of medical science, carrying a $10 million prize and immortal prestige. A distinction so grand that only 3 living scientists possessed it. On screen, Allison looked breathtaking. She wore an emerald silk gown that accentuated her graceful silhouette, her dark hair pinned back with effortless elegance. The applause inside the grand hall of the Paletta Nations was deafening as the presenter handed her the crystal trophy. I sat on the edge of the leather sofa, holding a cold cup of chamomile tea I had brewed 2 hours ago, waiting for her to come home. I hadn't known she was in Geneva. She had told me 3 days ago that she was attending a mandatory regional seminar in Chicago and had specifically asked me not to bother her with phone calls because her schedule was jammed. I had learned about the award 30 minutes ago from a breaking news notification on my phone. On screen, the lead international correspondent stepped forward with a microphone. "Professor Sterling, to become the youngest recipient of the Nolan Award in history is an unprecedented triumph. Over the last 7 years, your research into targeted cellular therapies has shattered every convention. Tell Yuzin this arduous, lonely journey to the peak of human achievement. Who was your greatest pillar? Who supported you when the door seemed locked?" I held my breath. A naive, foolish part of my heart, a part one thought I had buried years ago, strained forward. Allison took the microphone. Her smile was pristine, measured, and utterly radiant. There was not a single flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "Science is a lonely road," she said softly, her voice echoing perfectly through the speakers. "When you are breaking boundaries, no one can walk the path for you." If I must be honest, I reached this point entirely through my own relentless conviction and unyielding effort. I relied on myself. The host beamed. A true independent icon of modern science. "No mentors? No secret backer?" "None," she replied smoothly. Just my late nights, my dedication, and my team. Not a word. Not a mention of the home I kept warm for 7 years. Not a nod to the husband who edited her grant proposals until 4 a.m., nor the man whose silent billions kept her lab lights burning when every venture capital firm turned her away. I didn't exist. In her narrative of glory, Theodore Blake was an invisible nonentity. I stared at the screen as the broadcast faded into commercials. I set the teacup down on the glass table. My fingers didn't shake. My heart didn't beat violently. Instead, a strange, profound coldness settled into my chest, a quiet, crystalline clarity that I hadn't felt in nearly a decade. At midnight, the front door unlocked. The heavy walnut door swung open, and the crisp evening air rushed into the foyer, accompanied by the laughter of two people. Allison stepped inside, offloading her coat. Behind her was Kane Vance. Kane was 28, the newly appointed deputy chief of her research laboratory. He was tall, sharp-jawed, dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit, and carried an unmistakable air of arrogant Ivy League privilege. Over the past 6 months, he had become her constant shadow, accompanying her to galas, signing off on media releases, and standing right beside her in every press photograph. Allison froze for a fraction of a second when she saw me sitting in the dimly lit living room. But her composure returned almost instantly. "You're still awake, Theodore?" she asked lightly, placing her designer clutch on the marble island. "I told you not to wait up." I stood up slowly, keeping my hands in the pockets of my trousers. "Congratulations, Allison. The Nolan Award. The entire global medical community is talking about it." Her expression shifted slightly, a subtle defensive wall rising behind her eyes. "Oh, you saw the news." "It was hard to miss," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "The entire world knows. Every news outlet, every medical journal, every group chat. Even our gardener asked me this afternoon if we were throwing a party." I paused, looking directly into her eyes. "Why did everyone in the world know? Except your husband?" Allison let out a short, tired sigh, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Theodore, please, don't start this tonight. I am exhausted. It was just an award ceremony. I didn't tell you because it involved complex high-level international protocol, media circuses, and academic politics. You don't understand that world. Having you involved or dragging you along would have just complicated things." "Complicated things?" I repeated, digesting the word. "You told me you were in Chicago for a regional workshop. Because if I told you I was going to Geneva, you would have insisted on coming or asking endless questions." She retorted, her tone sharp with annoyance. "It was easier this way. You belong here, in a quiet life. You don't fit into the high-stakes academic sphere, Theodore. Why must you make my moment of triumph about your fragile ego?" Before I could respond, Kane stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Allison's shoulder. The gesture was familiar, intimate, and intentionally brazen in front of me. "Let it go, Theodore," Kane said with a patronizing smirk, his voice dripping with condescension. "Professor Sterling just achieved the absolute pinnacle of human medicine. She spent the last 72 hours dealing with Nobel laureates, heads of state, and global investors. The last thing she needed before taking that stage was someone who doesn't even know the difference between cellular immunotherapy and basic biochemistry hovering around her, dragging down her focus." He straightened his tie, looking down his nose at me like an emperor addressing a servant. "Know your place, man," Kane added, chuckling softly. "You keep the house clean, you make sure her dinner is warm, and you enjoy the comfortable lifestyle her prestige affords you. Don't embarrass her by trying to claim a seat at a table you didn't build." I looked at Kane's hand resting on my wife's shoulder. Then I looked at Allison. She didn't pull away. She didn't brush his hand off. She stood there, silently validating his words, looking at me with a mixture of impatience and mild disdain. In that singular second, 7 years of warmth inside me turned to ash. I didn't yell. I didn't smash a glass. I didn't engage in a petty argument with a boy who thought he was a giant because he was standing on a hill I had built. I looked at Allison, seeing her clearly for the very first time. She wasn't cruel by nature. She had simply grown so accustomed to my unconditional sacrifice that she viewed my existence as a Gavina background asset with zero cost and zero worth. She genuinely believed that she was born to soar, and I was born to crawl. "I see," I said softly. A quiet, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of my lips. "You're right, Kane. A table I didn't build. Allison frowned, a sudden, subtle sense of unease flashing across her face at my strange calmness. Theodore, just go to sleep. We'll talk tomorrow. No need, I said, turning my back on them and walking toward my study. Enjoy your victory, Professor Sterling. You earned every bit of what you think is yours. Inside my private study, I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The faint moonlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. I walked over to the antique bookshelf in the corner, reached behind a row of leather-bound historical volumes, and pressed a small, hidden pressure plate. A concealed vault behind the panel clicked open smoothly. Inside sat an ultra-thin, encrypted satellite terminal, a custom piece of military-grade hardware that had remained untouched, uncharged, and dark for 2,500 days. I picked it up. Powering it on, the screen illuminated my face with a cold blue glare. The interface bypassed standard protocols, connecting directly to an orbital quantum server network. I opened an isolated communication client that had only one entry in its address book. I typed in a master key phrase that I had memorized a decade ago. Within 3 seconds, the status icon turned from dark red to a brilliant, glowing emerald. A message window popped up immediately. The sender was labeled simply, Executive Office, Blake Holdings Global. Before I could even type a single letter, a text message swept across the encrypted screen. Biometric signature verified. Welcome back, Mr. Blake. 7 years, 7 months, and 12 days. The board of directors has kept your chair empty, exactly as instructed. The kingdom is intact. Instruct us. A second message followed immediately from my former chief executive secretary, Marcus Vancey, a man who oversaw assets larger than the GDP of most European nations. Sir, your sabbatical has dragged on far too long. The global biotech sector is stagnating without your direction. Is it time to end the farce? I stood in the dark, watching the messages scroll past. Outside the window, the city lights sparkled, lights powered by infrastructure my family owned, medical institutions funded by my foundations, and research networks created by my pen. I had played the quiet, devoted husband long enough. I had lowered my wings so she could fly, only for her to spit on the nest I made for her. My fingers hovered over the dark keyboard. My voice was silent, but my intent was absolute. I typed a short reply. Prepare my full reinstatement. Initiate the overseas transfer protocols for the Global Life Science Alliance. It's time I take back everything. A reply came back in less than 2 seconds. Understood, boss. Welcome back to the top of the world. By the next morning, Allison's victory had taken over the internet. Industry blogs called her the new face of American medicine, and local news outlets ran nonstop segments on the Sterling family. With that spotlight came a flood of high society invitations, and Kane Vance made sure he was attached to her hip for every single one of them. I attended a private dinner party at the country club that Thursday, not because Allison asked me to, but because her father insisted I show up so the family looked complete for the press. I stood near the back bar, holding an untouched gin and tonic, watching Allison mingle with pharma executives and high-net-worth investors. Kane stood right beside her, introducing her to guests like he was her manager. Julian Hayes, a hedge fund manager who had tried and failed to buy into my private holding firms years ago, walked up to me with a smug grin on his face. Theodore, buddy, Julian said, patting my shoulder with a little too much force. Look at you. Living the dream, huh? Most guys have to work 80 hours a week to get a room at this club. You just had to marry the right girl. I stay out of her way, Julian, I said, taking a slow sip of my drink. Smart move, he laughed, turning his head to watch Allison hand Kane her coat. You should be thanking your lucky stars every day. Without Allison, you wouldn't even get past the front gate of a place like this. A guy with your background? You'd be stuck managing a regional bank branch. Know your blessings, man. I didn't bother correcting him. I didn't tell him that I owned 60% of the equity firm that held his fund's debt. I just smiled, set my glass on the tray of a passing waiter, and walked out. Friday evening, I was in my study reviewing my offshore assets when Allison knocked on the door and walked in without waiting for an answer. She wasn't wearing her lab coat or gala dress tonight. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray business suit, and her face was stone cold. She placed a thick manila folder on my desk. We need to talk, she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the folder. What's this? It's a settlement agreement, she replied, resting her hands on the edge of the desk. A divorce, Theodore. I had my attorneys draft it this morning. I didn't flinch. I see. You didn't waste any time after Geneva. Allison sighed, letting out a heavy, impatient breath. Don't make this dramatic. Be realistic for once in your life. Look at where I am right now. Look at where you are. We moved in completely different directions years ago. You're content staying at home, reading books, doing nothing with your life. I'm running a global medical institute. We don't share the same goals. We don't speak the same language. And frankly, we don't belong in the same world anymore. We don't belong in the same world, I repeated slowly. Is that really how you see it? Yes, she said sharply. I need a partner who can stand beside me at international summits, someone who understands the weight of what I'm building. You're a good man, Theodore, but you're just passive. You have no drive, no ambition, and no real career. I can't keep carrying someone who offers nothing to my future. She opened the folder and flipped to the last page, pointing to a highlighted line. I'm not leaving you high and dry, she continued, her tone patronizingly generous. I'm giving you the house in the suburbs, $3 million in cash, and a monthly stipend for the next 5 years. That's more than enough for you to live comfortably without having to work a single day for the rest of your life. I looked up from the papers and met her eyes. And what if I don't want your money, Allison? What if I sign this and walk out with nothing? Allison frowned, clearly annoyed by what she thought was a foolish attempt at pride. Don't be ridiculous. If you don't take this deal, what else do you have to rely on? You have no income, no corporate connections, and no assets of your own. Without me and my family, how do you expect to survive in this city? I held her gaze for a long moment. The woman standing before me was entirely blind to the world she lived in. She had mistaken my silence for weakness and my devotion for helplessness. A quiet, cold smile formed on my face. Allison, I said, my voice quiet and steady, do you really think that if I leave you, I'll end up with nothing? She hesitated. For a split second, something in my voice made her step back. A flicker of genuine doubt crossed her facia's sudden, unexplainable chill. Before she could answer, the door of my study clicked open. Kane walked in like he owned the house, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Allison and leaned casually against the doorframe. Everything going smoothly, Professor? Kane asked, glancing at me with a smirk. Or is he giving you a hard time about the settlement? Allison cleared her throat, shaking off her brief moment of unease. He was just asking questions. Kane laughed, shaking his head. Come on, Theodore. Cut the tough guy act. We all know what's going on here. You're scared. You've been living off the sterling dime for 7 years, and now the ride is over. You leave this house, you're nobody. Stop pretending you have leverage and sign the paper before Allison changes her mind and cuts that alimony in half. I looked at Kane, then down at the pen sitting on the desk. There was no point in arguing. You don't waste breath explaining quantum physics to a child playing with blocks. Give me the pen, I said. Kane smiled triumphantly. Allison blinked, seemingly surprised by how fast I yielded, though she quickly masked it with a nod of approval. I uncapped the pen, turned to the final page, and signed my name in clear, sharp cursive, Theodore Blake. I slid the folder back across the mahogany desk. Keep your $3 million, Allison, I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. And keep the monthly stipend. I don't need a single cent from you or the Sterling Medical Group. Allison stared at the signed document, then looked up at me, bewildered. Theodore, don't be stupid. That's $3 million. You can't just. I said I don't need it. I cut her off, my tone dropping to an icy register that made Kane instantly shut his mouth. The marriage is over. You got what you wanted. I didn't pack much. Just a single leather duffel bag with my personal clothes, my passport, and the encrypted satellite terminal. Everything else in that house, the expensive furniture, the artwork, the cars in the garage had been bought with funds I channeled through proxy accounts anyway. She could keep the scraps. As I walked down the marble staircase into the main foyer, Allison was standing near the front door. Kane had already gone outside to pull her car around. She watched me carry my bag down, her arms crossed over her chest. There was a weird, restless look in her eyes, tension she couldn't quite hide. Where are you going to stay tonight? She asked quietly. You don't have to leave right this second. You can stay in the guest room until you find an apartment. I have somewhere to be, I replied, not slowing my pace. Theodore, she called out as I reached the door. I stopped and looked back over my shoulder. She stepped closer, her jaw tight. I hope you understand why I had to do this. It's not personal. It's just business and life trajectory. I hope you find something to do with yourself. I already have, I said smoothly. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and pulled up a private application. In fact, I just submitted my formal acceptance 20 minutes ago. Allison gave me a skeptical look. Acceptance for what? A job? A position overseas, I said. Chief Strategic Advisor and Global Director for the Global Life Science Alliance. Allison stared at me for 3 full seconds, then let out a dry, incredulous laugh. The Alliance? Theodore, the Global Life Science Alliance is the governing body for top-tier medical research institutes worldwide. They control 90% of international research grants. They haven't appointed a new chief strategic advisor in 5 years because the position requires approval from the highest board of international investors. You can't just lie about something like that to save face. I didn't argue. I didn't try to convince her. I simply placed my hand on the brass door handle. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night. Allison, I said gently. I pulled the heavy walnut door open and stepped out into the cool night air. I didn't look back as the door clicked shut behind me. Allison stood on the porch for a brief second, watching my tall figure walk down the driveway toward a black SUV that had just pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a rideshare. It was an armored Maybach with blacked-out windows and diplomatic plates. A driver in white gloves stepped out, bowed deeply, and opened the rear door for me. Inside the Maybach, I pulled out my tablet. An unread email notification sat at the top of my inbox. It was signed by the entire executive board of the Global Life Science Alliance. Welcome back, Mr. Blake. Your global appointment is finalized. The press release will be issued worldwide in 72 hours. The board meeting in Geneva awaits your command. I closed the tablet, leaned back against the leather seat, and looked out the window as the gates of the Sterling estate closed forever in my rearview mirror. Drive, I told the chauffeur. Yes, boss, the driver replied. Welcome home. 72 hours passed in a blur of corporate celebration for Sterling Medical Group. With the official divorce papers signed and filed, Allison focused entirely on closing the $500 million global expansion deal with the Global Life Science Alliance. The grant would fund her new research labs across Europe and elevate her company into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. On Monday morning, Allison sat at the head of the boardroom table in the Sterling Tower, surrounded by senior executives, her father Richard Sterling and Kane Vance. Champagne flutes were pre-poured on a side table, waiting for the final wire confirmation. The Alliance's board meeting in Geneva concluded an hour ago, Richard announced, tapping his tablet with a grin. Our legal team is standing by to confirm receipt of the initial $200 million tranche. Kane leaned over Allison's shoulder, holding his tablet. Everything is lined up, Allison. Once this hits, the board will officially name me Chief Operating Officer of the Global Division. Allison nodded, though an unexpected knot tightened in her stomach. Let's wait until the transfer clears before opening the champagne, Kane. Relax, Kane chuckled. We passed every committee audit with flying colors. It's a done deal. Before he finished his sentence, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. Allison's chief legal officer, Marcus Van Skane's uncle, walked in, his face pale and sweat glistening on his forehead. Marcus? Richard stood up, frowning. What's wrong? Did the wire go through? No, Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly. The wire was halted. The entire grant application has been placed on an indefinite administrative freeze. The room fell dead silent. What do you mean halted? Allison stood up, her chair scraping sharply against the hardwood floor. We signed the preliminary agreement in Geneva. The executive committee approved it. An hour ago, the newly appointed chief strategic advisor exercised veto authority, Marcus explained, placing a printout on the conference table. Every single pending project tied to North American pharmaceutical firms has been flagged for a full financial and ethical audit. Sterling Medical is at the top of the list. Kane slammed his palm on the table. That's ridiculous. Who is this guy? The position was vacant last week. Is some bureaucrat trying to extort us for a bigger cut? I tried to reach out through our contacts in Geneva, Marcus said, looking directly at Allison. They refused to talk details over email. but our liaison sent me a copy of the Alliance's official global press release issued 5 minutes ago. Allison grabbed the paper from the table. Her eyes scanned the bold header at the top of the document. Global Life Science Alliance announces appointment of Theodore Blake as Chief Strategic Advisor and Global Director. Allison froze. The color drained from her face completely. Theodore Blake? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard leaned over, snatched the document from her trembling hands, and read it out loud. Theodore Blake? As in, your ex-husband Theodore? That's impossible, Kane shouted, grabbing the paper. This has to be a typo or a cheap prank. Theodore Blake is a nobody. He doesn't even have a master's degree. He spent the last 7 years sitting on his ass in her suburban house. Look at the biographical appendix, Kane, Marcus said grimly. It lists his background. Founding partner of Vanguard Biocapital, chief architect of the Geneva Medical Charter, major shareholder in 11 Fortune 500 biotech firms. It's not a typo. Allison felt as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Her mind raced back to Friday night in Theodore's study, a quiet confidence in his eyes, his refusal of her $3 million, and his parting words at the front door. Chief Strategic Advisor and Global Director for the Global Life Science Alliance. She had laughed in his face. She had called him a liar trying to save face. Across town, on the top floor of the Blake Tower, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out over the city skyline. I wore a tailored dark navy suit, holding a hot cup of black coffee. Behind me, my executive secretary, Victoria, stepped into the office, carrying a thin leather folder. Mr. Blake, the formal freeze order on Sterling Medical Group has been executed, Victoria reported briskly. Their stock is down 4% in pre-market trading, and their board is in complete panic. Good, I replied without turning around. How are our offshore liquidations coming along? We have completely unwound Vanguard Capital's implicit guarantee on Sterling's credit lines, she said. Without our safety net, their commercial paper rating will drop 2 notches by the end of the week. My private phone began to ring on the desk. I glanced back. The caller ID displayed a familiar number, Allison Sterling. Victoria looked at the phone, then at me. Should I screen it, sir? No, I said, setting my coffee cup down. I'll take it. I picked up the phone and pressed answer, placing it to my ear. Theodore? Allison's voice came through the speaker, breathless and strained. Theodore, is that you? Speaking, I said, my tone completely neutral. Theodore, I just saw the press release, she stammered, abandoning all her usual corporate composure. Tell me this isn't some sick joke. Tell me what's going on. There's no joke, Allison, I answered calmly. You're reading an official announcement from the Alliance Board. There was a heavy pause on the line. I could hear her sharp breathing. Why didn't you tell me? She demanded, her voice rising with a mix of anger and confusion. We were married for 7 years, Theodore. 7 years. You played the clueless house husband while holding the key to the entire industry? You let my father talk down to you? You let everyone think you were living off my family? I never lied to you. Allison, I said quietly. You never asked. You assumed who I was based on what you wanted to see. You were so consumed by your own ambition that you mistook my silence for insignificance. That doesn't justify freezing my company's grant. She snapped. Is this revenge because I asked for a divorce? Are you using your new power to sabotage my life's work? Don't flatter yourself, I replied coldly. The freeze isn't personal. As Chief Strategic Advisor, it's my duty to review all pending high-risk allocations. Sterling Medical's financial backing relies heavily on unverified proxy debt that I personally held until 72 hours ago. Now that our personal ties are severed, I am legally required to audit your group. Theodore, please, her tone shifted abruptly, laced with a hint of desperation she had never shown before. We can fix this. Come back to the house. Let's sit down and talk about this like adults. Kane was wrong to speak to you the way he did, and I made a mistake rushing the settlement. I let out a short, quiet breath. It's too late for that, Allison, I said. The settlement is signed. The divorce is final. You wanted a partner who operated on your level. Now you have to deal with me on mine. Theodore, she tried to speak, but I didn't give her the chance. Direct all further communications regarding Sterling Medical to my legal team, I said firmly. Have a good day, Professor Sterling. I ended the call, set the phone back on the desk, and turned back to the window. Victoria stepped forward. Sir, Mr. Kane Vance is downstairs in the lobby without an appointment. Security says he's demanding to see you. A faint smile touched my lips. Send him up, I said. Let's see how tough he sounds today. 10 minutes after I gave Victoria permission, the heavy double doors of my office burst open. Kane Vance stormed in, his tie pulled loose at his collar, his face flushed red with anger. Two tall private security guards followed right behind him, looking ready to tackle him to the ground. It's fine, I told the guards, waving my hand slightly. Leave us. The guards nodded and pulled the doors shut, leaving Kane standing in the middle of my office. He stared at me behind my executive desk, taking in my tailored suit, the panoramic view of the skyline, and the sheer authority radiating from the room. For a brief second, his steps faltered, but his arrogance quickly reclaimed control. What the hell is this, Theodore? Kane barked, marching straight up to my desk and slamming both hands onto the dark polished walnut. You think you can play games with Sterling Medical? You think dressing up in an expensive suit makes you a big shot? I leaned back in my chair, adjusting my cuffs calmly. You're trespassing, Kane, and you're shouting in a building where you don't even have clearance to use the elevator. Cut the crap. Kane snapped, pointing a finger at my face. I know what you're doing. You bribed someone at the Alliance, didn't you? Or you pulled some pathetic favor from an old college friend to get your name on that press release. You're trying to get back at Allison because she dumped your useless ass, and you're using Sterling Medical's grant as leverage. I looked at him, completely unbothered by his outburst. Is that the story you told Allison to save your skin? I didn't have to tell her anything. Kane sneered. We all know who you are. 7 years living like a parasite off the Sterlings. You didn't earn a single dime in that household. Now you suddenly claim you're the global director of the Alliance? Do you really expect anyone in this industry to buy that load of garbage? I picked up a leather-bound folder from my desk, opened it slowly, and turned a page. Kane Vance, I said, reading off the paper in a measured voice. Vice President of Development at Sterling Medical. Annual base salary, $400,000. Personal debt across 3 offshore accounts, $8.2 million. Kane's expression froze instantly. The color began to drain from his ears. Where did you get that? He stammered, his confident posture collapsing. You spent $2 million last year alone shorting biotechnology index funds through a shell firm in the Cayman Islands. I continued, not taking my eyes off the file. You lost every penny. You convinced Richard Sterling to create the global COO position specifically for you, so you could take a $25 million stock advance to cover your margin calls before the audit. Shut up, Kane yelled, his voice cracking. That's confidential company data. You hacked our servers. I didn't hack anything, I said, closing the folder with a sharp snap that echoed through the room. Vanguard Biocapital owns 40% of the Cayman broker firm you used. I am the sole managing partner of Vanguard. In short, Kane, I am your creditor. Kane stared at me, his eyes wide with utter shock. He took a slow step backward, stumbling slightly against the guest armchair. No, he muttered, shaking his head frantically. No, that's impossible. Vanguard is a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund. You were just Allison's stay-at-home husband. You spent your days in the library. I spent my days managing asset portfolios while my ex-wife built her academic career. I corrected him coldly. I let her take the spotlight because I preferred the shadows. But you mistook my discretion for weakness. You walked into my home, handed my wife a divorce agreement, and told me I was a nobody. I stood up from my desk. The sheer weight of my presence made Kane retreat another step toward the door. You wanted power, Kane, I said, walking around the desk toward him. You wanted to stand beside Allison on the global stage. But you failed to realize that the stage you're standing on was built with my money. Kane swallowed hard, sweating profusely. Theodore, look, we can work this out. Allison, she didn't mean to push you out. She was just stressed about the expansion. If you lift the grant freeze, I can make sure you get a seat on the board. I'll persuade Richard. Do you really think I need a seat on Richard Sterling's board? I cut him off, laughing softly. By 5 o'clock today, Vanguard Biocapital will issue a formal margin call on your personal debt. If you don't wire $8.2 million by tomorrow morning, my legal team will file criminal charges for securities fraud. Kane turned pale as a sheet. His knees looked like they were about to give out. You're destroying me. You're going to destroy Sterling Medical too. Sterling Medical destroyed itself the moment it let you and Richard run it into the ground, I said coldly. Now, get out of my office. Kane opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Terrified and broken, he turned around, scrambled for the door handle, and fled into the corridor like a disgraced dog. Less than 20 minutes after Kane fled the Blake Tower, my private phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Allison. The caller ID showed Richard Sterling. I answered on the second ring. Theodore, Richard's voice was unusually thick and subdued, completely stripped of his usual overbearing arrogance. I'm calling on behalf of the Sterling family. Hello, Richard, I replied. I assume Kane called you from the elevator. Kane just told me everything, Richard gasped out, sounding like he was struggling for air. Theodore, is it true? Vanguard Biocapital, that's yours? It has been for 12 years, I said calmly. My God, Richard whispered. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Theodore, listen to me. We are family. 7 years. We had dinner every Sunday. You can't do this to us. If Vanguard pulls its credit line and the alliance cancels the grant, Sterling Medical will go bankrupt in 30 days. We were family. Richard, I reminded him firmly. Until your daughter handed me divorce papers 3 days ago, and you threw a party to celebrate. Allison was naive. Richard yelled, his tone turning desperate. She was misled by Kane. You know how focused she gets on her work. She didn't mean to cast you aside, Theodore. She loves you. She's just confused. She didn't look confused when she told me I had no ambition and offered me $3 million to walk away. I replied coldly. I will fire Kane today. Richard pleaded, ignoring my comment. I'll strip him of his title and kick him out of the company. I'll make Allison apologize to you publicly. Just give us 3 months, Theodore. Don't freeze the grant. The grant audit is already underway. Richard, I said, my voice as hard as steel. The alliance does not do business with compromised executives or fraudulent firms. If Sterling Medical wants to survive, I suggest you prepare for a full takeover. A takeover? Richard choked on the word. You want to buy my family's legacy? I don't want to buy it, I said smoothly. I'm going to reclaim what was mine from the start. Tell Allison I'll see her at the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. Without waiting for his response, I hung up the phone. Victoria stepped back into the office, holding an updated tablet. Mr. Blake, the board meeting request for Sterling Medical Group has been broadcast to all major shareholders. 48% of the institutional investors have already agreed to back Vanguard's voting proxy. Good, I said, setting the phone on the desk. Prepare my private motorcade for tomorrow morning. It's time to close the chapter on Sterling Medical. Understood, sir, Victoria bowed slightly. Will Professor Sterling be attending? I looked out at the city lights glowing beneath the dusk sky. She wouldn't miss it for the world, I said quietly. The board meeting at Sterling Medical Group was scheduled for 9 in the morning, but by 8:30, the top-floor boardroom was already packed. Every major shareholder, financial analyst, and board member sat around the long mahogany table in tense silence. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling, looking gray and haggard, flanked by Allison Sterling, who stared fixatedly at the heavy glass entrance doors. When Victoria pushed the doors open and I walked into the boardroom dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit, an audible gasp went through the room. Allison pushed her chair back instantly and stood up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Theodore? I ignored her gaze entirely, walking straight to the empty chair directly opposite Richard Sterling at the foot of the table. Victoria pulled out the chair for me, and I took my seat, placing a leather portfolio on the polished wood. What is the meaning of this? Shouted Arthur Pendleton, one of Sterling Medical's senior board members. This is an emergency meeting of voting shareholders and executive leadership. Why is Professor Sterling's ex-husband sitting in our room? He's not here as my ex-husband. Arthur, Allison whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She turned to face me, her posture rigid. Theodore, why are you doing this? If you're angry about the divorce, we can talk outside. You don't have to ruin my father's life's work to prove a point. Sit down, Allison, Richard said in a hollow, rasping voice, placing a hand on his daughter's arm. He's not here to negotiate. I opened my portfolio calmly. Let's bring this meeting to order. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Vanguard Biocapital acquired an additional 12% of Sterling Medical's outstanding floating shares. Combined with our institutional voting proxies, Vanguard now holds 51.4% voting control over Sterling Medical Group. The entire boardroom broke out into immediate chaos. Board members leaned over to whisper frantically to one another, while two shareholders slammed their tablets onto the table. 51%. Arthur gasped, turning to Richard. Richard, is this true? When did Vanguard gain controlling interest? Vanguard has been buying up distressed debt and equity options for the past 3 years, I answered on Richard's behalf. You were all so busy celebrating your quarterly earnings that nobody bothered to audit who was underwriting your convertible bonds. Allison stared at me, shaking her head. No, that's impossible. Theodore, you were at home. You were reading books and taking care of the house. You didn't even have a job. I had plenty of jobs. Allison, I replied coldly, meeting her eyes for the first time. One of them was ensuring that the woman who shared my bed had unlimited funding for her research without knowing where the money came from. But since you believed my lack of corporate titles meant a lack of ambition, I decided to let you see what my ambition actually looks like. Allison took a step back, her face losing all color. You funded the Sterling Lab? The initial $40 million grant from the Bio Alliance was underwritten entirely by Vanguard, I said smoothly. And because Sterling Medical failed to disclose Kane Vance's $8.2 million embezzlement and off-balance sheet personal liability, Sterling Medical is currently in direct breach of the Alliance covenant. Where's Kane? Arthur demanded, looking around the room frantically. Where's the COO? Kane Vance handed in his resignation at 6 this morning. Victoria chimed in from behind my chair, her voice crisp and clear. Federal law enforcement issued an arrest warrant for securities fraud and unauthorized access 30 minutes ago. He is currently in federal custody. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the boardroom. Richard Sterling slowly bowed his head, resting his face in his hands. It's over, he muttered. The company is bankrupt. It doesn't have to be bankrupt, Richard, I said, leaning forward. Vanguard is prepared to execute a full debt-for-equity swap. We will inject $100 million into Sterling Medical immediately, stabilizing the stock price and restoring the Alliance grant. A ray of hope flashed in Arthur's eyes. You'll save the company? Under 3 conditions, I continued, holding up 3 fingers. First, Richard Sterling steps down immediately as CEO and chairman, retaining 0 voting rights. Richard flinched, but he gave a solemn, defeated nod. I agree. Second, I said, moving my eyes to Allison. Allison Sterling will be stripped of her title as head of global research. She will remain at the company solely as a senior research fellow, reporting directly to an independent board appointed by Vanguard. Allison gasped, her eyes brimming with tears. Theodore, that's my life's work. You're taking away my lab? I'm saving your lab from your own hubris, I answered without a hint of warmth. You wanted to run a global enterprise with Kane Vance. You proved you couldn't even see the thief standing next to you. You are a brilliant scientist, Allison, but you are a reckless executive. From now on, you stick to the microscope. And the third condition? Arthur asked nervously. Third, I said, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. Sterling Medical Group will be officially rebranded as Vanguard Life Sciences. The Sterling name will be removed from all corporate headquarters, patents, and public filings. Allison stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. You're completely erasing us. You erased me from your life 3 days ago for $3 million, I said, walking toward the door. I'm just balancing the books. 10 minutes after the board meeting adjourned, as I walked down the grand marble hallway toward the executive elevator, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. Theodore, wait, please. I stopped and turned around. Allison ran up to me, her hair slightly disheveled, her expensive designer coat clutching her arms. She looked completely shattered, stripped of the poised, arrogant demeanor she had held when she handed me the divorce papers in our apartment. What do you want, Allison? I asked, keeping my hands in my pockets. Why didn't you tell me? She sobbed, her voice breaking. Why did you pretend for 7 years? If I knew who you really were, I would have never. If you knew I was wealthy? I interrupted with a cold chuckle. Then you would have stayed with me for the wrong reasons. For 7 years, Allison, I wanted a wife who loved me for who I was, not for my title, my portfolio, or my net worth. I gave you my devotion, my time, and a peaceful home. But you looked at all of that and saw a loser. I was stupid, she cried, taking a step closer and reaching out to touch my arm, though I stepped back to avoid her touch. Kane lied to me. My father pressured me. I thought we were drifting apart because you didn't care about my career. I cared so much about your career that I secretly bought 40% of your suppliers just to keep your lab costs low, I said softly. I cared so much that I personally reviewed every single research proposal you submitted to the Alliance to make sure it passed committee. Allison gasped, pulling her hands to her mouth. That was you? It was me, I said. But that Theodore is gone. You signed the divorce papers, Allison. You took the house, you took the car, and you gave me a $3 million check to get out of your life. The contract is finalized. We can tear it up. She pleaded desperately. We can start over. Theodore, please, I love you. I've always loved you. I looked at her, feeling neither anger nor resentment, only a profound, empty indifference. You don't love me, Allison, I said, as the elevator doors chimed open behind me. You just missed the safety net you didn't realize you had. I stepped into the private elevator. Victoria followed me inside and pressed the ground level button. As the heavy brass doors slowly slid shut, I watched Allison Sterling standing alone in the middle of the empty marble hall, weeping silently as her world crumbled around her. Where to next, Mr. Blake? Victoria asked as the elevator descended smoothly. I adjusted my tie and looked straight ahead into the reflective glass. To the airport, I said. We have an international expansion in Europe to oversee. The private jet cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. In the quiet leather-appointed cabin, I sat with a hot cup of black coffee, reviewing the quarterly expansion reports for Vanguard Biocapital's European headquarters in Zurich. Victoria walked over from the desk area and placed a tablet next to my cup. The domestic markets just closed in New York, Mr. Blake. Vanguard Life Sciences, formerly Sterling Medical, opened up 18% today following your press conference. The institutional buy-in was massive. And the restructuring? I asked, taking a sip of coffee. Complete, Victoria replied smoothly. Richard Sterling officially filed his retirement papers this afternoon. He's moving to his property in Florida permanently. Kane Vance's bail hearing was denied due to flight risk. His trial is set for next month, and the prosecutors are seeking 12 years for securities fraud and wire fraud. I nodded faintly, looking out the window at the endless sea of clouds. And Allison? Victoria hesitated for half a second before speaking. Professor Sterling reported to her new office in the research wing this morning. She accepted the demotion without protest. Our supervisor on site noted that she hasn't left her desk or spoken to the press. She tried to call your personal cell 3 times today, but as per your instructions, the calls were routed to our legal team. Good, I said, setting my cup down. Keep it that way. She has her science. That was what she always claimed cared about most. If I may ask, sir, Victoria said gently, do you regret not taking the $3 million settlement she offered? A small, dry smile crossed my lips. I spent 7 years giving her everything I had, Victoria. The $3 million wasn't an insult because of the money, it was an insult because it showed she never knew who was standing right in front of her. You can't buy back trust after you've priced it like trash. Understood, sir, Victoria said with a respectful bow. Our legal team also finalized the foundation papers for the Blake Research Trust. $50 million in non-voting shares have been allocated to fund independent biomedical researchers who lack corporate backing. Excellent, I said. Ensure no corporate strings are attached. I want those young scientists to have the freedom I never gave myself publicly during those 7 years. An hour later, the cabin phone signaled an incoming encrypted satellite call. I picked up the receiver. Theodore, a refined, confident female voice came through the speaker. It was Dr. Elena Vancino, relation to Kane, but the chief managing director of the European Biotech Coalition in Zurich. Elena, I greeted her, leaning back in my seat. I take it you saw the news from New York. Saw it. The entire European financial sector is talking about it. Elena chuckled softly. You swallowed Sterling Medical in 48 hours and turned a disgraced firm into Vanguard's flagship subsidiary before the SEC even finished their morning coffee. It was ruthless, Theodore. Typical of you. It was necessary maintenance, I said simply. Messy house, needed sweeping. Well, your timing is impeccable, Elena said, her tone turning businesslike. The Swiss Confederation just cleared the regulatory path for our joint venture in gene therapy. The European ministry wants a lead investor who actually understands both the science and the capital markets. I told them there's only one man for the job. I'm landing in Zurich in 4 hours, I told her. Have the contract drafts ready at the hotel. They're already on your desk at the Bauer Lac, Elena replied. Oh, and Theodore, congratulations on your newfound freedom. You spent far too long playing domestic ghost in America. The world missed the real Theodore Blake. The ghost is officially retired, Elena, I said softly, looking at my reflection in the dark glass of the plane window. From here on out, I operate strictly in the light. I hung up the phone and handed it back to Victoria. The plane began its gradual descent toward the European continent, breaking through the clouds as the golden glow of the sunset filled the cabin. For 7 years, I had built a legacy in secret, waiting for a love that turned out to be nothing more than an illusion. But as I adjusted my cuffs and looked ahead, there was no weight in my chest, only the sharp, invigorating clarity of a man who had reclaimed his kingdom. Prepare the briefing for the Zurich summit, I told Victoria, my voice firm and uncompromising. Right away, Mr. Blake, she smiled. The chapter on the Sterlings was closed. My story was just beginning.